Next up, we have a discussion led by our president of the LSCMS, Dr. Raymond Krishna. Okay, he needs no further introduction, Dr. Raymond. So the panel topic is on the post-pandemic pharma cold chain operations. On the panel, we will have Preeti Jauhari from Schneider. Pardon me if I pronounce your name wrongly. We also have Srinivas Sasubili from Pfizer, as well as Marshall from Zulik. I'd like to welcome on stage. Round of applause. Those who are sitting at the feel free to move further up front. There are still many empty seats on the tables. Okay, do mingle with the fellow colleagues over here. Thank you. Over to you, Raymond.
Thanks, Derek. Good morning, panelists. Do we have microphones? Yes. All right, excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we've got a bit of feedback here. We can adjust the sound a bit. I hope all of you can hear me. Yeah? So like Derek said, please move forward to the front of the room. I think the panelists will appreciate speaking to seeing a sea of faces, addressing a sea of faces. So we're quite fortunate this morning. We've got Preeti Jauhari, Srinivas Sasubili, and we've also got Brett Marshall, who's not just with Zulik Pharma, but also a board member of the Logistics and Supply Chain Management Society. So welcome. To kick us off, starting with you, Preeti, can you give us a bit of an introduction about yourself, what you currently do, and also very importantly, what you used to do before your current role?
Sure. Am I audible? All right. Good morning, everybody. Preeti. I am from Schneider Electric, and my current role is I head a global supply chain transformation for planning in the organization. Before this, I come from different industries, but primarily pharma, medical, and CPG, and probably that's the reason I kind of signed up. So you can see, personally also, I'm in a very dynamic world other than the outside VUCA world as well, right? So happy to be here and share more about my learnings over the years.
Thanks very much, Preeti. And yourself, Srinivas, can we have a quick introduction on yourself and what you currently do?
Sure, Raymond, thank you. Thanks for this opportunity to speak on the current cold chain. Personally about me, I'm passionate about a couple of things. Passionate about end-to-end supply chain. Before coming to Pfizer, I have been in manufacturing with Novartis and end-to-end planning with Johnson & Johnson Consumer. And today in Pfizer, I currently lead the global logistics planning, and it's kind of defining the way we need to be working in an overall global environment in logistics planning.
Excellent, thank you. Brett.
Thanks, Raymond. I'm Brett Marshall. I'm the Corporate Head of Quality and HSSE for Zulik Pharma. Zulik Pharma is one of the largest healthcare services providers in Asia, representing more than 300 clients across a footprint of 13 countries in Asia. And we operate through about 80, bit over 80 distribution centres in that geographic footprint. So my background is logistics and supply chain, and I've been working in the quality space for the last 8 years.
Thanks, Brett. So before we go into the panel, I'd just like to remind everyone, we do have Mentimeter. We hope to see those questions coming, yeah? And I think we'll get a lot more out of this panel if we actually have questions coming from the floor, right? Also, for those of you who know me well enough, will know that we actually don't have a script of questions that we follow during my panels, right? In fact, the first time I spoke to Preeti in my whole life was 15 minutes ago, Preeti, right? When I met you at the front desk. So we like keeping it real. We've got a very excellent group of experts or supply chain professionals assembled today. And it would be more interesting if we had a bit of a dialogue. So even if you disagree with what we're saying, and sometimes I'll be a bit risque and try and contradict them, right? It'd be also good to hear your perspective, especially for those of you who attended the Shippers Council meeting yesterday, right? Let's keep this interactive. We're here to learn, discuss, debate, and question. So let's try and do that, yeah? So to kick us off, however, I'm going to start with you, Brett. What's different? In the last couple of years, supply chain has gain prominence or become more important. We've all realized the importance of supply chains and also the prominence of cold chain in supply chain, the pharma cold chain. What's changed? It's become more important, it's risen to the fore, and what's different now compared to pre-COVID?
Thanks, Ramon. I think the pandemic period saw the rise of cold chain through the requirements of the vaccines that were being produced to counter the pandemic. And that lifted the lid, I think, for the industry on a whole range of practices. There was a great deal of preparation made around the world for the arrival of the vaccines. And so there was a great deal of discussion, planning, investment in infrastructure, systems, technologies, processes, and also importantly people. We were going to be dealing with products at ultra low temperatures in volumes that we'd never seen before. And though we didn't realise it here in Asia at the time, in the early stages of preparing for the vaccine, our access in Asia to those vaccine suppliers was very minimal by comparison with the rest of the world, well, Europe and the US in particular. And so we were dealing with product that was life-saving, that had very specific handling conditions, and that had a performance expectation of zero defect, because every vaccine dose that arrived in Asia was important. And I think that really changed the game and increased the level of collaboration around the industry. But it's also seen a dramatic increase in what technology has been able to enable as well. And I think that's what makes the future quite exciting, because we now have much higher levels of capability in handling these types of products in this geography, better than we have ever had before, but we still have a lot of work to do.
Thanks, Brent. Thanks for the opening. And I'll come back to that. I want to ask about access to vaccines, especially in the global south. You know, a lot has been done, but I wonder if it's been addressed. But we'll come back to that. Your perspective, what's different pre-COVID and now?
Definitely, a lot of things have changed, right? During the COVID, I think this is the first time ever the entire world has been hit with COVID, and there is a lot of pressure, particularly on the pharma organizations, to be able to cater to the needs of the patients, right? And the organizations were able to do it. And most importantly, during this process, there is so much of learning to the organizations, right? Start with the basics. So if you can look at what happened during the COVID pandemic, a typical product life cycle management, and you can imagine in a pharmaceutical world, and particularly in an innovative pharmaceutical world, how long would it take to even deliver a product to the patient? And during pandemic, right from the time we were hit with the pandemic, and time the first product has been delivered to the patient, the overall lead time is in just few months compared to like few years when it comes to an innovative solution, right? And obviously that impacted the entire supply chain. A lot of pressure in the end-to-end supply chain. Obviously there is a lot of focus on cold chain, particularly when you're talking about the COVID situation. The entire cold chain supply chain has to be need to be robust to deliver the product with utmost quality, right? Because if we are not meeting the cold chain needs, we lose the product, and it's few $1 billion into cut. Right. So definitely, I think there is a lot of change in the organizations, particularly the way we look at things, particularly the way we need to kind of cater to the supply chain needs, and most importantly, the supply chain evolution as well. Right. There is a lot of focus on digital enablement, a lot of focus in terms of a cross-functional collaboration, which could be enabled digitally. And every single, and even the internal collaboration, right? You know, breaking the cross-functional silos within the organization to be able to deliver to the patient needs. So in summary, I think there are a lot of spectrums and a lot of areas which has changed during the COVID, and COVID is in a positive way. It challenged the organizations, and the future is definitely bright.
Excellent perspective, Srinivas. I'm going to come back to you on a question about, do we have short memories? You know, Priti, your opening remarks, post and pre and post COVID, and I'm sure we'll have a nice segue to what you're doing now at Schneider.
Sure. Well, I'm tempted to answer the point that you mentioned about short memories. I'll hold that. So my opening comments would be to add as two perspectives. Before, when it comes to planning and preparation during the pandemic, I think we all know it was all around, how quick we can get to action. So very little time when it comes to planning and preparing for the actual real execution, right? And I think post-pandemic, there is a realization that companies need to focus a lot more in planning and being prepared for the next pandemic, right? And it goes back to the comment that you made is, do we have short memories? Are we doing enough to be well prepared proactively for what's coming next? Yeah, so I think that is one of the key call outs when we look at pre and post. The other one I would want to call out as between, pre and post is the amount of data has always been around. However, between pre and post, we saw that data was connected in a new way. And that connected data across each node in the supply chain brought in immense visibility. And I think it was one of the key enablers which pandemic enabled. And, that's something that's carried over as absolutely must have and not good to have from a capability standpoint.
Thanks, Priti. So, Srinivas, coming back to yourselves, we chatted a bit this morning about product perspectives and what are some of the learnings and the latest developments that we've seen. So, when you, Brett, and I were chatting, we said, let's start with the product, the manufacturing, and then we'll go into the distribution of the supply chain. So, what are some of the things that you've seen? What are some of the learnings or the latest developments that we've seen?
Yeah, sure. Definitely. In terms of the, obviously, majority of the team here would understand what does that mean when it comes to a product life cycle management in a typical pharmaceutical industry, right? I personally have been in pharmaceutical as well as consumer industry. Definitely the product life cycle, in fact, the end-to-end supply chain lead times when compared to any other industry, the pharmaceutical industry is the longest because there are so many elements in the supply chain, right from the product development, right from the clinical trials, getting the approvals in the market, deploying the product to the market. So the overall end-to-end lead times are definitely much longer in a typical pharmaceutical industry, right? So that's exactly kind of refers to the point that I was mentioning earlier. COVID has challenged this entire spectrum. And every element in the end-to-end supply chain has been enoughly challenged. And today you can see the entire process has just happened in few months, including the regulatory approvals, including the trials, all that happened in just few months. So that challenges the organization whether can this be a new norm of the product development, right? Because if traditionally we were taking few years to deliver a product, and today if we are able to kind of manage it in few months, why can't it be the new norm of the next level of product development? So I'm sure every organization in pharmaceutical industry is considered this way because this has a lot of impact in terms of the overall working capital, in terms of overall delivering the product to the patient needs. So definitely I think the way forward is more to look at the entire product life cycle management, right from the R&D till the product is delivered to the patient.
Okay. So this is a question to the panel, yeah? I've always felt that the pharma and the medical industry are a bit of laggards in terms of this thinking. So, Srinivas, I think you started by saying that digitalization, cross-functional development, but I think the pharma industry is laggard. I would consider if any time I want to think about developments in supply chain management, I look at the retail industry, right? You've got POS data that gets fed back to your DC, that gets fed back to your manufacturers and your distributors. So what's your perspective on that? Would you agree with that? Would you say, no, actually pharma's the leading the charge, or that's changing, there's a mindset shift? What is your perspective on that, the panel?
Yeah, maybe I can bring in this experience, right? I know. In fact, I was also associated with Johnson and Johnson, and along with Preeti in my earlier roles, and it's in end-to-end planning, demand, supply, inventory, and also, and you can imagine like J&J is huge with both consumer, medical, and pharma, right? So you have the wide spectrum of business types and you support. And definitely the agility of supply chains in each one of these sectors is different. And to make a comparison between a consumer and pharma, definitely there is a component of agility in supply chain, right? Is definitely different. Maybe the reasons are kind of some of the elements which I was highlighting earlier, right? From the time of the product development, the long lead times, the network, because it's not easy to produce a pharmaceutical product in a local network, unlike a typical consumer. So we are talking about the long lead times, and we are talking about long regulatory lead times, because every market has its own regulatory needs, the Board of Health approvals before the product launch, etc. So essentially what we are talking about is a very, very long lead time. We may not completely say that the pharmaceutical sector is laggard, but it's kind of constrained by elements which are beyond the pharmaceutical sector, right? Control, right? Board of Health, we are not controlling network. It's very difficult to kind of get the active pharmaceutical ingredients available in every single market. So essentially it is constrained by elements which are beyond the control. And also, if I have to kind of even compare, a typical consumer industry is driven by demand, like, consumer is the driver. And the typical pharmaceutical industry is controlled by the constraints, right? When I say controlled by the constraints, the patient needs the product. But pharmaceutical industry kind of struggles today because there are so many constraints in the network. You have constraints in the supplies, you have constraints in the capacities, you have constraints in the upstream. So yeah, it's more like the entire ballgame has changed from like a huge demand in the market versus a constrained supply, right? So yeah, to answer your question, obviously, I think the challenges with the typical pharmaceutical sector would face totally different versus a consumer sector, and that defines the agility. And with all the changing environment, with the upgrade in the technology, with all the upgrades that are happening, definitely pharmaceutical sector is looking forward towards bringing in more and more agility in the end-to-end network.
Thanks, Srinivas. I think you wanted to add something to that, Preeti?
Yeah, I just want to say that, I also had a similar interesting mix of, say, CPG on one side and then medical and pharma on the other. And if we compare, I think, it probably will be fair to say that, you'll always put pharma and medical a little on the laggard if you're comparing with absolutely fast-paced consumer goods, right? But there have been pockets of successes in the pharma industry as well, right? And when I say that, when we look at technology, like in terms of IoT, usage of IoT, usage of track and trace capability in the pharma industry, clearly, that's something, if you look in the last 4 years, has evolved, right? So not just from a cold chain temperature control standpoint, but, overall end-to-end traceability of pharma products. And even the price point, 4 years ago, what costed to put IoT in a pharmaceutical, now it's probably a fraction of it now. So I would say there have been pockets of successes or advancement in the industry as well. So yeah, I mean, while we look at it broadly, I think where it applies also does play a role, right? And if we look at the whole adoption of telemedicine outside of that, the adoption of the fact that how cold chain itself has evolved in the last 4 years from where we started, wherein, there was a complete, I would say, not knowing the canvas of how cold chain is going to be designed from a efficiency as well as cost effectiveness point of view. I think there has been a great evolution. We see a lot more maturity. There are a lot more players out there who are able to do it much more efficiently as well as sustainably. So, yeah.
All right, thank you. Brett, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I think one of the key issues for the pharma industry is also that there is a set of regulations around manufacturing and distribution that are premised on making sure that product integrity is maintained, that product safety is maintained, that patient safety is maintained. And that applies to the systems and the technologies that we use not only in manufacturing but increasingly in supply chain as well, because the regulators promulgate their regulations to ensure that the technologies that are used by manufacturers are fit for purpose in the production process. But the rules that apply to supply chain, good distribution practice, similarly share those same requirements around qualification of systems, validation of technologies that you are going to use. Anything that potentially touches the quality of the product must be proven to be fit for purpose. And that applies to all technologies, temperature monitoring, packaging systems, anything that's involved in traceability of batch-related data or other product specifications. And it's a very highly bureaucratic task. And so that does slow down the pace of innovation. COVID is forcing us to catch up, and manufacturing is certainly leading digitisation with Pharma 4.0. How that gets mirrored into the supply chain is one of the things that I think is going to be interesting for the future.
Thanks, Brett. You know, when we put this panel together, little did I expect there to be so much interest in the topic. Looking at Mentimeter, we've got 9 questions from the audience. So my work is done. You know, I don't have to moderate anymore. I'll just ask you guys the questions. You know, this is actually something that we talked about this morning, Brett and Srinivas, yeah? What has changed post-pandemic, given the time sensitivity and cargo integrity requirements are very much the same, right? So we talked about that from a supply chain technologies perspective. So maybe Srinivas, you'd like to start with that.
Yeah, definitely a lot of change, right? I think I would kind of take back this question to the panel topic itself, where we said, how are the organizations looking at moving from a reactive approach to a more proactive approach, right? This is like building agility into the process. And when it comes to the logistics management, I think definitely every organization has its way to manage its freight forwarders, the external logistics service providers, the way they need to manage the capacity, the way they need to plan for their financials, the budget planning, RFPs, everything has to change, because now we move from a reactive way to more proactive way. This is not like looking at what we could potentially get versus what we get in the past, right? So this is like a complete paradigm shift, and that's where there is a lot of focus in connecting between different planning functions as well. Like, you have the demand planning, you have the supply planning, you have the site production planning, and as the organization, size of the organization gets bigger, you can naturally see these functional silos built in the organization, and that's important to break these functional silos to establish those connectivity and the collaborative working environment, particularly at the operational level, which is the tier 1 within the organization. So a lot of changes happening, and it's all supported with a digital enablement, right? So we still do not want to kind of go the whole way of working, and it's like a futuristic, autonomous, and I think even in yesterday's discussion, if you can remind ourselves, there is definitely the autonomous is the ultimate supply chain. Today we are kind of trying to connect across functions with more like alerts and automation and stuff like that.
You know, thanks, Srinivas. So totally unscripted, yeah? It just so happens, I don't know, I think many of you have got this month's issue of Logisim with you. And if you look at my message this month, I said that, you know, we as human beings have short memories, so it should not come as a surprise. And of course, it is always easier to revert to the tried and tested habits of the past as opposed to breaking away and trying something different. So on this topic of short memories, the question here is, are those supply chain requirements during COVID expected post-COVID, given the reduced impetus? What's your perspective?
I think if we break this down and look at it from the perspective of temperature-controlled management, and it's an ecosystem. The ecosystem is made up of infrastructure, systems, technologies, processes, people. I think we have in place what we've been able to kind of build on, excuse me, is the platform for that ecosystem. And it needed to be there whether COVID came or didn't come, because there's still a heavy dependence on the health of populations in this region in particular, on patients being able to access vaccines and other cold chain related products. So have we created something that we can't use? I don't think so. Are we ready for what comes in the future? I think we're more nimble than we were before and potential to be more agile. I hope that...
Yes, so I'm going to stay with you, Brett. We're more nimble with the potential to be more agile, right? So the question we have here is, what do your contingency plans in the event of the next global emergency look like? And we'll follow that with Srinivas as well from Pfizer's perspective.
Yeah, I think certainly you'll hear me repeat this ad nauseum about infrastructure, systems, technologies, processes and people. We've built our capability to be able to operate in situations where we are placed under great pressure. We operated during lockdowns. We were able to continue our service capabilities when roads were shut, borders were closed. Sometimes we lost entire third-party labour suppliers. But we were still able to deliver products to hospitals, pharmacies, drugstores, and ultimately to patients. So I think that redundancy has been established. And I think our ability to respond, in some cases, like in the Philippines, when the lockdown occurred, it happened without notice. And it wasn't just the country borders that were closed, but every province in the Philippines had a different way of responding to the government instructions. So we had to learn to respond very quickly and get government communication in place, be able to communicate with the enforcement authorities and make sure that that service capability as an essential service was reinforced. And I think putting some of these platforms in place has been really important.
Thanks, Brett. Srinivas?
Yeah, maybe I'll relate this with what was happening during the COVID versus how the organization is preparing towards the next gen, right? It kind of, obviously by now you would also understand, it's very difficult to deliver a product in just few months. That means the entire organization had to be kind of really restructured. Means technically you need to look at the end-to-end supply chain as to how the product planning, the manufacturing happens and the delivery. During COVID, majority of the functions are kind of, do you really think that we did a demand planning for a COVID vaccine or a supply planning for a COVID vaccine or even production planning, right? So majority of the functions almost kind had to be bypassed to make sure that we produce the product at whichever facility at the fastest pace and then we deliver to the markets, right? So that's exactly we cut down majority of the lead times before the product could be delivered to the product, right? And obviously, I think taking the things from what was happening during the COVID towards the post-pandemic, definitely now the need is like how do we really move towards a more futuristic way, looking at like what the market really needs, what the patient really needs, connecting it to what the sites are actually shipping and how we can bring in this visibility to the freight forwarders to enable them to plan for the capacity planning, whether it is a transportation capacity planning, warehouse capacity planning, all those. And in fact, as you can imagine, the entire world is moving to a new way of working, which is a sustainable way of working. Which to me, it's not easy. It's not easy for any organization because the way probably organizations could support COVID is a huge set of air freight, and which is definitely not sustainable, right? So, and I think that's where the technology, the way the organizations and evolve is kind of developing those technologies which are more cost effective and also sustainable, right? And yeah, that's going to be the future, and not just to the pharma sector, but also the entire chain of entities which are involved, whether it is a freight forwarder, whether it's a transporter, whether it's a pharma innovative company, generics. So everybody will be, working on the new norm, and that's the new way of working.
Okay. So you know how I started the panel by saying I'll be a bit risque. I'm sure Srinivas is aware of this. Does anyone have any idea what Pfizer's revenue was in 2019? Anyone want to hazard a guess versus 2020? Does anyone have an idea? Pfizer's revenue in 2019, I just checked. I wasn't playing with my handphone, but I just checked. Pfizer's revenue 2019 versus 2020 grew 95%. Okay, so pre-COVID, I think Pfizer was an $800 million company, and it's now a $85 billion company, and of course it's coming down. It'd be quite interesting to see what Pfizer does next. But to change gears a bit, we've had a lot of infrastructure put in place during COVID, right? Those of you who deal with 3PLs, every 3PL now comes to me and says, oh, you know, we are cold chain and pharma supply chain experts. But 2019, they didn't have such a capability, or they weren't touting it, right? And I would hazard a guess that many of this is on the back of developments because of COVID. So, question to you, Brad. All this infrastructure that's been put in place, or that they say is put in place, yeah? Will it be fully utilized? What do we do with it now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we've certainly hit a COVID vaccine cliff. We'll see whatever vaccines there are will shift from being supplied by the government to being supplied through private market. But I think there is still a push in terms of development of biological medicines. One of the reasons that that COVID products required ultra-low temperatures was because they were effectively being pushed out through phase 4 clinical trial stage. And so the stability data around those products was still relatively unknown. And I think that that will also be an issue for some of the new products. So I think there will be a requirement. Will it be of the volume that we've had for COVID vaccines? Probably not, but there will be a sustained growth in capacity requirements going forward.
Maybe just to add on, I think maybe I think this is in limit of the time. If a vaccine need to be developed, it need a specific temperature conditions. But obviously, it had to evolve because having a shipment delivered in such a cold environment is definitely very difficult. It's like so much of impact on the product quality, so much of impact on the sustainability piece, and definitely the technology has been evolving, not just in a couple of months actually, as to how we can deliver this product in a much better sustainable way, like compared to what we started off, right? So I think from an overall end-to-end supply chain standpoint, cold chain, yes, definitely there is a lot of enhancement in terms of technology. In fact, I am sure like you are already aware of real-time temperature monitoring, which is more impactful to a pharmaceutical industry compared to a consumer health industry or any other industry, right? Where the product quality is so very much important. The temperature conditions at which the product need to be delivered in is important, and also the lead time of the quality release once it reaches a regional distribution center or market distribution center with all the impacts in the temperature needs, right? Everything is important. I think the technology has evolved. So yeah, with whatever new product portfolio that will be in pipeline, I think that's the best case scenario.
Thanks a lot, Srinivas. So somewhat related to that, the question that we have here is sometimes pharma shippers impose a temperature requirement but want cost savings resulting in compromises. Quality over cost, which weighs more? That's the question.
Quality, no second thought. There is nothing like cost in this game, right? It's all about like product quality. It's about delivering the right quality product to the patient, and because we are actually putting the life of the patient at stake if we sacrifice the quality. And I was also kind of referring to the earlier statement. Even a small spike in temperature, it kind of puts the entire product to trash, and it's few $billion, right? So definitely the first preference is quality. Cost comes next.
Brett, your perspective?
I think it's a question back to the audience. If you're going to have a medicine injected into your bloodstream, or you're going to put a tablet in your mouth, what's more important to you, quality or cost?
I was actually in New York on Friday, and I went to a comedy club, right? And this comedian said, you know, when we go shopping, we want to have Prada, Giorgio Armani or whatever. But in the US, apparently, when they go and buy pharmaceuticals, they go and buy generics, you know. So that's a hard question to answer, Brett, when you think about it. We want to have nice shoes, you know, nice wallet, watch, clothes, but then we also sometimes compromise on that as well, you know, especially in the US, you know, in the generics perspective. So I agree with you, it should be quality over cost, yes? Winnie, I have a question for you. We had a conversation yesterday with Roger Chu from SFS. What was the question about, Winnie? Can we get her a microphone? Maybe steal one from one of the panelists, because I can't hear a word she's saying.
Maybe, Raymond, while the mic is going there.
Yes. Maybe we can walk a bit faster as well, miss? Yes. We do have a time limit. Yes, Preeti.
No, I just wanted to add one comment to what Brett said, right? Is that it also depends on who we are asking that question to, right? Because sometime I think where affordability is a question, probably, you know, the balance between the cost and quality will also get compromised. So just wanted to add that.
No, very well said, Preeti. What were we talking about yesterday with Roger?
So it's about the shock watch cargo, whether it's stackable or non-stackable.
Shock watch cargo, yeah. So it's an interesting perspective, yeah. We had this conversation, I worked with Winnie. So a 3PL told us, oh, you know, if you have shock watch cargo, you cannot stack the cargo. Have you all heard this? How many of you say that? If you have shock watch cargo, you cannot stack cargo. So I asked my co-workers, and we asked 3 or 4 freight forwarders that were here. I won't mention their names. I'll talk about them at the Shippers Council meeting later. And all the 3PL said, oh, no, if you have shock watch cargo, you cannot stack it, right? So then we went to Roger, and what did Roger say? Why don't you pass the microphone to Roger and see what Roger says?
Raymond, lucky I was paying attention. Yeah.
Lucky Winnie was paying attention.
Yeah, I said it can be stacked.
It can be stacked, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, and the conversation we had, Roger, yeah, was that very often we get advice from experts in the market, and I think Mona talked a bit about it as well during her presentation. But not all of this is actually true. Yeah? So we have to be a bit mindful of this. You know, this infrastructure that's in place, and will it be fully utilized? But also, do we really need to go to that level of development or capability or expertise? You know, like the shock watch example. Sometimes it's just noise that we don't necessarily need to listen to. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that one of our objectives is always to ensure that we have the optimum level of control of process. And optimum does have some component of cost involved in it. But we're really trying to balance how do we comply with international regulation, how does that relate to local regulations, how does that relate to the expectation of the international manufacturers, but at the same time it comes back to product safety, product integrity, patient safety. And we do try and balance, and so in supply chain we talk about good distribution practice, which is not quite as strict as good manufacturing practice, but it's getting to that point. And we have to be really careful to balance our compliance capability to still be allowed to able to operate our facilities.
Thanks, Brett. Thank you. We'll skip this one. Next question. Wow. This is an interesting one. Given that we are heading into El Nino for the next 3 years, where temperatures in many countries will be higher, are pharma companies carrying out thermal stress reviews of their cold chains? Srinivas?
Yeah, definitely. I think it depends on the product quality and the product needs as well, right? So definitely, I think not every product which we produce and ship to the markets need a cold chain need. And definitely some of the categories is the vaccine supply chain, which requires a cold chain. But yeah, definitely there is a set of, even 80% of the portfolio which do not read a cold chain, particularly as low as like a -20, -30 degrees centigrade. So it's a mix, I would say, and the component would definitely need a complete cold chain strategy around that one. And definitely there is another set of product portfolio which doesn't need that level of stringent regulations or needs in terms of the product quality when it comes to cold chain management.
Thanks, Srinivas. Preeti, you want to add
Just a
something?
quick comment on that is, I think eventually it boils down to the efficacy, right? As long as we are able to maintain the efficacy of the product, I think that right temperature, whether it's ambient versus what is required, I think that is the key, rather than generalizing it to where it is applicable.
Yeah, and the efficacy could be evolved over years, right? And it's like, associated to the product development, something we started a couple of years, maybe the efficacy needs a very stringent temperature needs. And with the improved product development and the stability data, we can actually prove that this is still efficient at a given temperature as well.
Thank you very much. So before I hand it over to the panelists for their closing remarks, do we have any other questions from the floor that we'd like to ask? Yes, the gentleman here. Microphone, please. Preeti, can you pass the young lady the microphone? And if you have any follow-on questions, please don't hesitate to ask as well.
Thanks for everyone. Okay. It's a really nice discussion about the cold chain. But if you think about the cold chain, it's coming to the picture only the COVID-19. Am I right? That's why we are discussing about this matter. But you are the cold supply chain experts. Can you give any use case or things? Which one we can implement? Like which one we can make it as a digitalization in the future instead of thinking about the past? Do you have anything? Thanks.
Preeti?
So did you mean in terms of, just a quick clarification, digitalization with respect to the cold chain in the future than in the past?
No, that's why I'm telling. The cold chains come into the picture due to the pandemic. Okay. But we have to think about the long time. The supply chain is the long process, I'm right. But yesterday also we are discussing about how we can make it as a transparency, how we are moving to that cloud. Okay. So a lot of people don't know which product we can use it, like which one we are not digitalized. Okay. So we have separate node by node. We don't have the connection.
Correct.
Okay. So in this case, do you think anything still we are missing the main process, we are not digitalized? Yeah.
Okay. So maybe two things, right? On the first comment that, yes, cold chain, I think that has enhanced over the COVID. But if we look at, say, food and beverage, it was always there, right? I think the ultra cold environment was something that was newly introduced as part of the COVID, right? But to answer the second point, I think I mentioned this earlier, that the accessibility and connected data really enhanced. So from a digitalization perspective, right now we are seeing a lot of focus across the industries to have that connected visibility across every node in the supply chain, right? And I think that is a very, very critical ability to be able to have that transparency across the whole flow, especially more critical when it is inter-regional flows, right? Because that's where, as Srinivas said, longer lead times, if there is any quick action that needs to be taken, the first starting point is having visibility to what is not working. Having that timely visibility is critical. Therefore, that accessibility and that connected visibility has really become the focus area across the board right now. And I think most organizations have definitely begun, and they're at a different stage of maturity when it comes to digitalization at this piece. I still feel, from my experience, what I've seen, I think that visibility has gotten better. Are we there where it is seamless? I don't believe so, right? There are still silos in terms of, so there is a visibility, but is that completely connected? Are each functions talking to each other in a seamless manner to say, okay, now we have a shipment which is stuck, probably somewhere in Europe to be delivered to somewhere in China. Are we taking the right actions so that we still meet the customer time? Probably there's a scope of improvement there.
Okay, thanks, Priti. You want to say something, Srinivas?
Can I add on?
Short and sweet, please.
Yeah, so I think I would say cold chain has always been existing. It's just that COVID has increased the focus of cold chain, right? And as Preeti has highlighted, it's about a visibility, not just within the organization, but beyond the organization. That means the product is going with the forwarders, with the LSP providers. Everywhere we need to have that visibility. Whether it is a temperature, non-temperature needs, it's more about making the connections every single node, and the different organizations have different level of maturity.
Thank you. Brett?
I share very much. Yesterday, Wolfgang gave a great presentation on what the future should look like in terms of collaborative capabilities, and a whole lot of information flows that need to be more effectively managed. That is still the aspiration, I think, for us as an industry. Yes, we have greater visibility than we had before, but every company is doing its own thing. And until such time as we're able to really bring the multiple systems that our supply chains are using, from point of raw material procurement to patient consumption, then to talk about end-to-end visibility and real-time capabilities is still, it's only scratching the surface. And we have to take a look at the bigger picture.
Thank you, Brett. So I'm going to ask you for a final comment, but almost unrelated. I mean, it's related, but almost unrelated to the topic that we've been talking about. We've got a couple of students here. We've got students from STEI Institute, one of whom is sleeping at the front of the room here. We've got some from NTU and SP Jain as well. What's your advice to young supply chain professionals entering the industry? What is one piece of advice you would give them? Starting with you, Priti.
I would say supply chain is a great place to start with, right? Because that is a place where you will have that end-to-end visibility in terms of process, tools, and systems. So great place to start. And I'll just quickly say that, 10 years ago when I went to university, I did have somebody raise hand and say, what is supply chain? What is the use of technology in supply chain? Today it's totally different, right? We are specializing in that. So I think it's a great way to accelerate your career in supply chain.
Thank you very much. Srinivas, some advice?
I love supply chain, right? And I've been trying to do my best in trying to understand end-to-end supply chain in manufacturing, external manufacturing, end-to-end planning, logistics. So supply chain is a great place to be in. Probably the key watch out is the evolution itself, right? The supply chain has started World War II, and past one decade, the evolution has been great. And now with the artificial intelligence, it's going to even change. So it means the change that you can expect in the next 5 to 10 years is going to be transformational. It's not going to be. So there is no way that you could look at history. This is how the organization have evolved. Look into future. This is how the organization would evolve, and that means it's a complete different change. So stay focused and stay tuned.
Thank you very much. Yeah, AI. Yeah, I mean, we didn't have to think about that 30 years ago when I started in the industry. Brett, some parting advice?
I think supply chain is the greatest vocation that you can have. You have to have a broad knowledge across a number of different areas: quality, regulation, supply chain, technology, human capital management, and sustainability, to be able to make an impact. And being able to understand all these different areas helps you to prepare for the issues you're going to have to face today and plan for the infrastructure and technologies and processes you're going to need for the future. You have a very important role to play.
Thank you very much, Brett. And with that, please join me in thanking our panelists. Excellent perspectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you.